going to record now. All right, well, thank you for joining us. So today, our presenter, we're so thrilled that she could join us from the East Coast. Jamia Wilson is a feminist activist, a writer, and speaker. As the director of Feminist Press at City University of New York and the former VP of programs at the Women Media Center, Jamia has been a leading voice on women's rights for over a decade. Her writing has appeared in numerous outlets such as New York Times, The Today Show, CNN, BBC, among many others. She's the author of Young, Gifted, and Black, Step Into Your Power, 23 Lessons on How to Live Your Best Life, Big Ideas for Young Thinkers, The ABCs of AOC. I love that title, by the way. And she's also the co-author of Roadmap for Revolutionaries, Resistance, Advocacy, and Activism for All. So since all of your cameras are off and your mics are off, I will give a big round of applause for Jamia on your behalf. So thank you, Jamia, for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and hi, everyone.
All right, so for those of you who are just trickling in, as I said, we do have a chat function, so feel free to submit any questions and we'll try to get to them at the end. So as I mentioned, you wrote a book called Young, Gifted, and Black, which showcases 52 Black icons from the past and present in an illustrated book specifically for younger readers. And I'm just wondering if you could take a moment just to expound upon why it's so important for all people, but especially children from marginalized communities, to see themselves represented positively in the books that they read.
Well, Marian Wright Edelman is someone who I very much respect, and all of the great civil rights work she's done and education work she's done. And I went with my late mother to a Stand for Children conference when I was maybe 10 or 11 years old, and we heard Marian Wright Edelman speak, and she said that you can't be it if you can't see it. And I've thought a lot about that throughout my career, and thought a lot about, what it meant for people in my life who couldn't see it and somehow were able to be it under a lot of duress and a lot of obstacles as well. And although representation doesn't completely transform systemic barriers to access that we need to address to get equity and to get equality, representation has a way of showing us a reflection of ourselves, being able to recognize oneself in a book, being able to recognize oneself in the stories of who we are as humans helps us develop empathy for others as well as ourselves, and also helps us to see our potential and understand the potential of others in a broader, more expansive and inclusive way. So I came up in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up, and I'm turning 40 this weekend. And I was lucky to grow up during a time when there had been more of a burst of diverse books, but still not a lot. And I often felt like I was left out of the books that were at the top of the curriculum in grade school, middle school, etc. And one of the reasons that I write, I think, is therapeutic, because I want to write the books that I wish that I could read, but also because I know about the power of representation. I know what it means to see yourself and then have that expand what you think is possible in your own life. And I think, lastly, what I really enjoy about it too is being able to show diverse young people, whoever they are, whatever their backgrounds are, great people who have been erased from history or who've been silenced or minimized in the broader conversation because they're not a part of dominant culture. So for me, it's important too that these books are given to all children. And one of the best things that I've received are letters from all over the world from kids who are saying, I am Chinese American living in Texas, and I love Misty Copeland, and she makes me see that I can be a ballerina and I can be an athlete and an artist. That same young person who sent me that letter also said we should do Young, Gifted, and Asian. And so I wrote her mom back and said, I think that's a great idea, and I think you should write it, because you also are closest to the stories of your own community, and will also be able to do that reflection back in the ways that honor you best. And I think we can all write about the human family, and obviously, race is a construct, but I do think there's something else so important about those of us who have positions and platforms through our books, helping to lift as we climb and bring other people into the space as well, and to expand the body of work. We all benefit when there are more stories. More stories just make everyone's lives better.
Absolutely. I mean, just look at the impact that a movie like Black Panther had, you know, absolutely. So you've written several other children's books that also tackle major issues such as race, gender, justice, managing disagreements. So these are all issues that even adults, we have a difficult time discussing in a constructive way. Can you tell us why you've chosen to write about these heavy topics specifically for younger readers?
I am really big on, and I think, you know, I even pontificate about this sometimes to other folks who I'm working with on books, either on both sides of the desk. I want to respect the intelligence of my readers, and that includes readers of all ages. I like authors who respect my intelligence, and I always have. When I was a child, you know, adults that would speak to me as if I was a small pet who couldn't understand complex things was always something that bugged me. And I actually always write a little bit higher than the grade level than that I'm targeting, because I believe in the intelligence and the innate power of the fire of curiosity in children and in younger readers. So I've sometimes gotten critiqued for that. I'll see reviews sometimes where people will say, oh, this is for only children with high IQs. And I'll say, oh, IQs are constructs, which is a whole other conversation. But also, I believe in the intelligence of my readers. And it means that people can interact with the books in different ways. There are some readers who come with all sorts of varying abilities who might not understand every word. They might gravitate to the beautiful illustrations of Andrea Pippins and many of the children's books that I work on. They might gravitate to seeing an image of themselves in it, but that engagement with the book is what matters to me as an author. And it's not necessarily my business how they choose to engage with the book, but as long as they connect and feel something and it creates some sort of shift or an affirmation of what they already believe, then I feel like my work is done. So I really like taking on those complex topics and making them accessible, taking the gravity and taking the weight away from those topics and just saying, what if we just looked at some of these things that we've told ourselves are hard to talk about, and then just said, we can talk about them because they're a part of the human experience, which is why I write about things like, why do we die? Why do we love? Is a just society possible for young people? And how to disagree. I think teaching kids conflict aversion is actually something that I think is very unhealthy. And I think specifically when you teach kids who are from marginalized communities that they cannot speak their minds, or they cannot address their needs or set boundaries, that we're really doing a disservice to people who are already having to navigate an unjust power dynamic. So it's important to me also that kids who read my books can go in and say, oh, okay, I may be in a classroom where the power dynamics don't feel right for me, or a friendship, or even maybe a family where I'm not being talked to in a way where I'm being treated with dignity and respect. But I know in this book, it says that I have innate dignity, that I am enough, and that my opinions matter. And I think that some of those readers are also the ones that I'm really, really speaking to when I think about it and I'm putting pen to paper or typing mostly on my computer. I'm thinking about them to say, hey, if you're the one who went to look for a book like this because that was your resort to find connection because you felt alone, then my job is done.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I'd imagine that you probably have older readers and adults reach out and they say that those books impact them as well.
I love when that happens. I get a lot of tags on Instagram of people who said this book was just for my kids, or I bought one for me and I bought one for my kids. I always love that, especially with Step Into Your Power. I get a lot of adults who do the exercises in the book. And to be honest, I'll confess a little secret, which is there have been times when I come up against those same human emotions. You know, they always say that you should teach what you have to learn, and you're continually learning your patterns and unlearning your patterns. That often my husband will say, hey, I really think you need to take out Step Into Your Power and do your exercises right now and remember that wisdom that you have. And then I do them, you know, that we all are facing doubt. we're all facing all sorts of things all the time, especially in this pandemic world. And I write those workbooks not just for my readers, but also for me, that I go back and I do those exercises. I go back and say, oh, I remember that time that I said, okay, if you don't fit in, pave new ground. I said that, and I didn't feel that earlier today, or I didn't bring that to that conversation or conflict today, but I can remember that I have it in me to know that and to do that and to be that. And I will tomorrow or 2 minutes from now restore and return to that.
Oh, that's wonderful. You practice what you preach.
I try. I have a t-shirt I was wearing yesterday that said walk the talk. So I try to do that as much as possible.
Yes, and so as I mentioned before, you also you co-wrote the book Roadmap for Revolutionaries, which, for those who aren't familiar, it's a handbook of effective activism, advocacy, and social justice for all ages. And the book offers all sorts of practical strategies that people can use to promote and affect social change at the local level, state level, federal level. And although it was written several years ago at this point, it feels more relevant than ever, as many people are now asking themselves for the first time, what can they do to address all the issues in our country, like systemic racism? And I'm wondering, can you share some strategies from your book for people who want to make a difference to address some of these major issues in our country, but they just don't know where to start? And also, often in your speaking and in your work, you talk about being everyday revolutionaries. I'm just wondering if you could just spend a moment kind of expounding upon that concept.
Yes, thank you. So I wrote that book with two other amazing women who actually are based in the Bay Area, Carolyn Giron and Elisa Camahort Page. And we worked on the book sort of coastally. So they were both in the Bay and I was here in New York, and I went to the Bay a couple times to see them. And our publisher was actually based in the Bay, although they're part of a bigger publisher that's headquarters are based here. And we wrote that book because we wanted to know how we could take everyday actions and how we could advise the people in our lives who were saying, help, I'm scared. We're feeling threats to our democracy everywhere. And yet we are so overwhelmed. It's hard to know what the next step is. And so we thought, what was it that helped us kind of navigate things when we were younger? And we thought about Scout handbooks. And Carolyn Giron, whose brainchild it was to come up with the book in the first place, is an art director too by training, and really amazing understanding of propaganda art also. And so we had a lot of fun looking at, okay, what would it be like if you had a Scout handbook that you could go to in the moment when you're feeling overwhelmed by, say, a pandemic and an election and the postal service, and all of those things are up in the air, or whatever thing that you can't even imagine you're facing. But what would be the things that would give you tight, concise, well-researched, accessible, and knowing advice about what to do next, and also what could do that in a nuanced, intersectional way that would recognize that we all have different identities that impact the way that we have access to rights. And we really wanted to make sure that we did our readers a service by saying too, okay, do you know what your rights are if you're a student? Do you know what your rights are if you're a worker? Do you know what your rights are to assemble and go to protests if you have a green card versus if you don't, or if you're a citizen versus if you're a permanent resident, et cetera? And so we really went to do that kind of research. And you can find in this book everything from how to lobby your elected officials, to how to start your own media platform, to how to start your own party, if that's something that you want to do, because a lot of times people talk about that, but don't actually know that starting your own party actually takes a lot of money and paperwork and time. And so we did the research to kind of look into all those things so that people really know what it is. And we also have case studies from everyday revolutionaries, as we call them, who just decided to go local and find the things that they could do that could really make change and create a ripple. And so what we like to say is, triage all the issues. There's probably a ton of issues that you care about, and all of those issues feel really important. And we advocate in the book that as you work on the different issues, you can take really, really sharpened, discerning, intentional steps to focus on the issues that are close to you, or focus on the issues systematically that you've decided are the most important, and then also to bridge with others who can work on those other issues as well, because sometimes we get overwhelmed when we're trying to do all the things. And so we do some guidance in the book there about how you can really make a ripple where you are, whether it's doing something like shareholder advocacy around your 401k and looking at what those investments are, and to advocating for equal policies and workplace advocacy around parental leave, to how you can help others practice self-care in demonstrations with advice from doctors who were at Standing Rock. So we have all of that in the book as well. And what I love about the book too, from a publishing standpoint, is for the forward, we actually engaged a lot of different organizers and people who were everyday revolutionaries and from all walks of life, to do a little bit of an oral history to talk about the first time they engaged in activism, or a time when they felt like an action they took changed things. And so that's what we really wanted to equip readers with, is an opportunity to find themselves in the book. And we also chose not to make the book partisan. I mean, it has a clear progressive point of view because of the people who wrote it, but we give everyone opportunities to research things for themselves and tools that they can use to take action in their communities for the issues they care about, and also, you know, have a trust for the people who are doing that work to use that work to do good.
It's great. And I'm curious, for a book like that, that's so multifaceted, and also just the work that you've done in activism and grassroots organizing, did you have to do a lot of research and speaking with other like policymakers at local level or federal level, or even Congress members? I'm just curious what goes into creating a huge handbook like that.
Well, what was great was that because there were three of us, there were three people to divide the research and divide the writing, but a lot went into it because we didn't have a long lead time once we sold the book to write the book and get it ready. And because we came in with an artistic concept, we also hired and worked with other illustrators in addition to the art director on our team, who was also a writer. And so there was a lot of project management that went into coordinating three different authors and then two illustrators and then working with our editorial team to get this all together into a actual book. And we did it in about a month, like a little bit over a month, once it all came together. But we had actually done some sample chapters right after the election. So we had been working toward that. So we had a good idea of what the concept was for the book proposal, and then continued to build it after talking to people in our community and looking at what are the questions people are asking now in this moment? What are the questions that we have and that we're hearing from people in our community about safety? What things do they need to know? And we have everything from, hey, what do you do if you get tear gassed, to concepts around what do you do if you need reproductive health care and you need to get that support and those resources with limited income, et cetera. So the book spans widely, and having three of us really helped because we could each take on a third of the chapters and own the research for each piece. But it was a lot, and it was a really intense process that will bond you with other people, I will say. I mean, just doing end notes alone for a book like that is a lot of work. But we're really glad we did it. And every step of the way, we were just thinking about the people. And in fact, we dedicated the book to everyone who is rolling up their sleeves and doing their best to be everyday revolutionaries. And so I'm really glad that people are equipping themselves with this book right now, because we need it right now. I mean, we had no way of knowing what was coming, but there's so many times when I look at the book, and even somebody close to me was arrested for something that I said, oh, you actually, if you had read the book, would have known that you didn't have to agree to that search and seizure, actually. And next time that happens, here's what you can say, here's what you can do, and here's how you can take action. So a lot of it too is about knowing your rights. And that's what I loved about the research process, was just about being able to now, I have a good sense of what my options are and what my rights are from going into this. And I just think that everyone deserves a civic education and have it to be accessible, which is one of the reasons that it's a paperback book and that it has the trim size it has. So you can have it in your tote bag, you can have it in your purse.
No, absolutely. It's something that's, yeah, like I said, more relevant than ever. And I'm sure it's something that people will continue to reference, especially in these times that we're living in now. So kind of building on that last question, so since the killing of George Floyd, this major protest movement has just swept across the entire country. And as a result, even some big corporations and politicians on either side of the aisle are now beginning to acknowledge that systemic racism is a major issue, and some are even saying the words Black Lives Matter. Do you think our country is actually beginning to move the needle in addressing systemic racism in any kind of tangible way, or do you view these as mostly symbolic gestures? And also, what are some policy changes that you think our country really needs to address these issues head on?
What I think is really interesting is I've talked to some elders, times like these, I really want to get an intergenerational standpoint and viewpoint around, oh, what have you seen? Where have you seen this before? How does this all connect to what you've seen? And, what do you think that we with next generations can do, and what the generation younger than myself can do? But, what have you seen, and do you think we've progressed? And I've talked to a couple of people who have said who were marching in the March on Washington. My mom had marched in the March on Washington as a teen, and I had the honor of interviewing Jane Elliott recently as well, who
Wow.
did the brown-eyed, blue-eye experiment that many of you probably did. I know I did it in high school. And I asked her, and just asked a lot of other people who, had done things like freedom rides, who had really experienced a lot of the same sort of racial strife and unrest, but also experienced some things that are harder and worse than they are now, or at least in plain sight worse. And some of those people are saying that what is exciting about this moment is that although there were always multiracial movements and that there were always white allies involved, that to see the large numbers of mobilization of allies and white allies who were saying Black Lives Matter specifically, or seeing a large number of people who have the privilege of citizenship marching and putting their bodies on the line for undocumented people and saying it's not okay to separate families. That large number of people, and seeing that is something that is a sign of progress. And then also just the vast majority of the next generation, much younger than myself, who by and large tend to lean toward progress when you look at their views on climate change, et cetera. And so I actually feel very hopeful. I think that we are in a really hard time now, but I think it's because we're on a reckoning. We are in a cultural zeitgeist. And we've seen those types of years before. We've seen, I didn't see it, but I've heard about it. 1968, for example, 1970, 1945. There are times where in those years, there were major things, when the Spanish flu pandemic happened, that was another one. And we're living in one right now. And so it feels really unprecedented, but I'm going back to history a lot to kind of say, okay, what can we learn from then, and iterate it, and then also be reflectful and mindful of where we're going now and what lessons we don't want to repeat, and what resources do we have now that they might not have had then that we can use. And so hearing from some of the folks who say, yes, we're in a hard, difficult time that is more difficult than most people have had in memory. There are people who have said that just the sheer numbers of people who understand that things need to change being so much larger, or at least being so much more vocal, is a point of progress. And I believe that too. And I think that when you see the Women's March, for example, which I had the privilege of writing the introduction and oral history for that book, the fact that it was the largest march in recorded history around the world, and that it came together so quickly. When they asked me to write the book, the time was really a short amount of time, that I remember saying, there's no way I can do this, because I had a day job, everything. But then when I started interviewing the women, and I realized, oh, wow, a couple of people had babies during this process and only had 5 weeks to plan the largest march in the history of the world, then surely I can burn the midnight oil and get my part of this book written. not that I would recommend that anyone, do that, and that was a choice that I made, but I would just say that I'm really hopeful that I think right now a lot is being laid bare. And Gloria Steinem, who is a friend and a mentor who I've worked with a lot, has said that you have to name it in order to change it. And I think this is a naming year, that we are naming a lot of problems. A lot is being laid bare by COVID, but a lot is also being laid bare in our institutions and systems. And I think that's part of why you're seeing a lot of companies also realizing they need to make these commitments, because the inequities that might have been talked away or covered away in the past are now just being laid bare, that we see that we have to reimagine how we engage in power. We have to reimagine how we engage in our structures, and we have to do these things differently and change the story of power in order to thrive and sustain and survive. So I'm actually, solemn and sad about a lot of what we're seeing, but hopeful that the things that fall apart will give us an opportunity to rebuild with new knowledge and new empathy and appreciation for what we can do together when we do it together and when we share resources.
Absolutely. And as far as, I agree. I think that it's definitely encouraging to see just the sheer numbers of people and the younger generation as well. It seems like people are on the right side of history for the most part. But as far as the policy aspect of it, are there any major policies that you think could be put into action now to try to address systemic racism?
Oh, I mean, there are so many. So one thing that I was really excited about was, I've had many, many debates with people who say, oh, reparations, that's just something that we can never do. And we've seen how that is actually possible. And with other groups, we've had examples of that. But I've been seeing some initiatives, like an initiative in a town in North Carolina near where my family's from, where they are doing reparations on a local level and integrating that into some of their policies and programs around housing, et cetera. And it's exciting to me to see that, to say, oh, we're reimagining how we are distributing resources within our communities. And so that's one policy piece. One of the issues I think that comes up a lot is a lot of times when people talk about defunding the police, people don't understand what that really means as a movement and as a theory, which really means distribute funds so that you are creating conditions and giving access to services that will create healthier communities so that there will be less need for policing. And I think having those conversations with people and talking from a place of common ground and shared values about what values do we all share. Most of us value security. Most of us value community. Most of us value safety and health for our families and kids. Most of us value being able to be in beloved community and collaboration and partnership with others. And so how can we create policies that reflect that? I am really, really interested in what we can do around the environment. I mean, California, from this short time I lived there, I do really miss that aspect of what is possible policy-wise. I would love to bring some of those policies east that we see in California as it relates to environmental justice, knowing that this entire nation could grow and the world could grow in that regard. But I think that there's a lot that we each individually and collectively can do to do our part to respect the planet for all that the planet gives to us every day. And that is actually action for racial justice as well, because environmental racism is such a big part of why we have so many health disparities. When I lost my mom to cancer, she really wanted me to tell people in her last days that she really believed that environmental racism and toxicity and the dumping of waste products in her neighborhood growing up was probably what led to her and many others getting and developing cancer, otherwise healthy people with no genetic markers. And those are things that we should really be talking about, linking all of these issues, linking together all of these movements and seeing how we can have a racial justice lens in each of the things we care about. If you care about the environment, how are you addressing inclusion in that space? How are you addressing who are the people who are most marginalized when it relates to environmental injustice? Healthcare disparities, same thing. if you have privilege, how can you help those who don't have access to insurance, who don't have access to healthy food to eat, who don't have access to transportation to get to healthcare. Many times those will be communities of color. And then the number one issue that I just have to get at, because it's October 2020, is voter suppression.
Yes.
Because voter suppression is a major issue anyway. I have a particular thorn in my side because my first election was the 2000 election and I voted absentee. That was a year of hanging shards and controversy around that. And I've always felt like part of my activism has come from trying to avenge the fact that I felt that my first vote was stolen from me. And many others. And so I think that what we can do now is those of us who can help bring others to vote with us, help other people in your family get those absentee votes, or if they're going to vote in person, to get their safety plan and their voting plan set, to be a poll worker if you can, to do voter education. I am doing voter education work with a collective right now. I'm doing text campaigns and donations in my home state, helping to support some candidates there with text banking and organizing people to do fundraisers and that kind of thing. And so I think it's just really important to think about how we can make sure that every vote gets counted and that the votes of people who are often left out are counted and respected. And so even if that means if you have transportation and you can help others in rural areas specifically too, or others who may have mobility issues get their vote out, that that is a huge service not only to them, but to yourself and to this entire civic practice of community that we're in. Everyone needs to be heard. And so I think that's extremely important. And I think that countering voter suppression also will have impacts on the court, reproductive justice, women's rights, and the Equal Rights Amendment, which is also a really important piece of legislation that I want to see ratified in my lifetime, because I, as a woman, want constitutional equality. I am annoyed that we had a popular vote winner who was a woman who, if she had been in the seat of president, would still not have had constitutional equality because there's no Equal Rights Amendment. So that's what I want for us. I want to have an amendment so that all genders will be respected in the Constitution, and to have that codified. And there's local work we can do on that too.
Absolutely. And for those who maybe aren't familiar, how far are we to getting that ratified and getting that as an amendment? I know that isn't it just a few states, or?
It's just a few states. We're so much closer than we've ever been. And that's why I get really excited now when I say I really hope to see it in my lifetime, because I think that it has taken so long. And I think that there's so much amazing work that's being done. Full disclosure, I'm on the advisory council for the ERA coalition, so I could go off on an ERA tangent anytime if anyone wants me to. But it is just such an important piece of legislation. A lot of people don't really understand what it would mean if we had an ERA, and how many of those social issues we care about that would be resolved if we had an ERA to point to, you know, just issues of parental leave and parental care in the workplace, how to address sexual violence and sexual harassment. Just so, what would have Me Too have looked like if we had had an Equal Rights Amendment? There's the sky's the limit, marriage equality, the threats to marriage equality that we're reading about in the papers right now, all of that. Equal Rights Amendment would be something that we could have to help us uphold the law for everyone. And you know, for me, when I lived in Washington, D.C., it just always bugged me to walk by the Supreme Court and to see it say in stone, equal rights under the law. And to know that that is actually not guaranteed or true, and that there have been Supreme Court justices who've actually utilized the lack of an Equal Rights Amendment to say, well, actually, we can't say that's gender discrimination, or gender discrimination isn't covered in the Constitution. So we can't do anything about it. You know, that was Scalia. That was, you know, one of his major points of view, and there's still people who believe that today. So I think that if anyone is interested in the ERA and looking at how you can support efforts around the ERA, go to the ERA Coalition website, and also just support some of the amazing women and men and trans folks who are leading efforts for the ERA nationwide. And so there might be people in other states too who are doing ERA work that you can help in those states that need ratification to move. I mean, when Virginia ratified the ERA, I just let out a holler. I was so excited. And that to me made me think, oh, I think North Carolina is going to be next. And there's a lot of people who are working for that. And I'd also like to say that the ERA has always been a multicultural, multiracial movement, and there's been an erasure of the role of women of color in the ERA fight for a very long time, and a lot of that had to do with how media was covering and shaping it, and also how opponents to the ERA were shaping it. But I would like to just say that a lot of the people who are responsible for introducing and advancing the proactive legislation that has brought us to where we are now are women of color, and I'm really excited about what that means for us too, as the relationship of racial justice and equity and gender justice are intertwined, and that it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We need to be working together to make those issues right on all counts. And so I really love following the work of people like Pat Spearman at Nevada, who is doing amazing work and using her position as an elected official to champion the ERA as well. And just looking to the leaders who really understand what's at stake and why we need constitutional equality and why we need it now.
Absolutely, and that actually leads me into a few questions I had. But before I get into that, I also just want to encourage everyone who people who came in late. We do have a chat box, so feel free to submit any questions for Jamia, and we will try to get to them here at the end. But so you mentioned Scalia, you mentioned the Supreme Court, and that kind of brings me to this question that, you know, we all know, you're an outspoken champion of women's rights and feminism for many, many years. So with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and President Trump's nomination of very conservative judge Amy Coney Barrett, are you concerned with the direction that our country may be headed with respect to women's rights, whether, you know, regardless of who wins the election?
I am. I think that my first reaction, I was really distraught in our loss of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think she's just such a role model to all people for what it means to live a righteous life and the service of justice and the service of the promise of what America can be and working toward that. And I'm still mourning her with so many people, but also really believe that her wish that she stated at the time of the ending of her life and her transition to her family, which was that she really didn't want there to be the naming of another justice until the election happened, I think is right and just. I think that we had this conversation happen around Merrick Garland.
Yes.
And, you know, I think it's interesting that the selective amnesia is happening right now, but I think in light of all the things that are happening, the global pandemic, that I think that it's really concerning to have us facing this kind of ideological political move during this time when we could all be coming together to find proactive solutions and to find justices who would uphold the will of the majority of the American people, because so many of the views of this particular justice are just extreme compared to what most Americans think and what most Americans want. And so I'm deeply concerned about this, and you know, I'm a part of the fight to push back against this and its impact and effects no matter what happens, because we need to make sure that everyone who needs comprehensive health care gets comprehensive health care, and we need to make sure that people who are of all genders have their rights and who form their families based on their own decisions and their own rights and wills are able to do that without interference. So I'm really concerned about it. And I'm also sad. I think, you know, I'm a person of faith, and one of the big things that has bothered me is just seeing a real mischaracterization or sort of this one note understanding of what it means to be a Christian. And so that's something I talk about a lot in my activism as well, to say that actually the Christianity that I was raised with was much more similar to the practice of Martin Luther King, as well as, you know, just direct action activism to be of service to the people who are in the most need. And being raised from Southern civil rights activists, you know, I'm really concerned about what I'm seeing right now in terms of just seeing more of sort of a extreme push and shift to set us back more than 50 years, maybe a century. So I believe that this election is extremely important, and that the actions that we take now will have reverberations for the next 100 years. And so I'm just trying to tell everyone I know to really think about that when we think about how we vote, if we vote, and who we vote for, that, you know, we don't have the luxury to necessarily have exactly the people we want all the time, but we do kind of have clear ideas about what our options are to be able to kind of maintain what our values are. So that to me is heavy on my heart now, but I've been a part of some Supreme Court fights before, and in my earliest life as an organizer. And I think that the coming weeks are going to be challenging ones, but I also think they're going to be a real test of the democracy, and we're going to get to really understand what the people really want.
Yeah, and so I do have more questions, but I saw a good question come in here, so I wanted to make sure we get to that before we run out of time here. So this is from a patron in attendance. She was asking, do you think that there is an opportunity to fight against social issues through a startup, besides the fact of hiring diverse employees? Do you think that changes for this situation can only be driven by legislation or nonprofit organizations?
I think we can all do what we can with the power that we have. You know, I always say step into your power, and we all have power in the places we're in, and sometimes we just have to be reminded of it, or to look right in front of us to see where it is. In Roadmap for Revolutionaries, we actually talk a lot about what companies can do, and ways that you can do shareholder advocacy in a company, ways that you can actively create coalitions in your work environment to be able to do social justice affinity groups, etc. So I recommend getting the book, but then also recommend thinking about what it is that you have the power to do in your workplace. One example I love to give is in the Feminist Press, where I'm employed. I had an amazing junior level, entry level staffer whose job was to oversee operations around office supplies, production materials. We needed to mail books, distribution, etc. And one day she came to me and said, hey, I found out that the company that makes our bubble wrap are big donors to some administrations that we don't agree with and that don't align with our values as a feminist organization and an organization that believes in human rights and racial justice. And here are some suggestions of suppliers that we can work with who share our values. And when you think about how much we spend on bubble wrap as a publisher, we're sending out books all year round, you know, I thought this is a really amazing example of a really important sort of micro action someone is taking within an organization, within their power, and bringing it to someone who has the ability to shape the budget, which is myself and other senior folks in the organization, and to change that. And then that led me to say, oh, we should actually think about what this means for our code of ethics, and maybe we could codify what kinds of companies we're buying from, et cetera. You know, we're going to have an investments committee to talk about what kind of investments we work on if our nonprofit gets gifts of stock, for example, and having people really decide what kind of investments you want to have and which ones aren't in alignment with the values of the company. So those are just a couple of examples, but I think there's actually a lot of things. I mean, even right down to food. For food, whenever we would order food for events, I would always try to support marginalized communities, if at all possible, or to get food that had a low carbon footprint. And there's an organization I really love to partner with in New York called Food to Eat, and they work a lot with immigrant-related chefs and restaurants and caterers, et cetera, to be able to introduce people not only to amazing food and cuisine and amazing entrepreneurs, but also to address the disparities and challenges and access barriers that a lot of people know they're working with. And that is a startup, and that company actually started as a startup, which I think is interesting. And so, you know, I see a lot of certified B Corps doing a lot of really great work too around, you know, the mix between sort of the nonprofit values and the for-profit structure, and to become a social good corporation. And I think that every company kind of knows what works best for your model, but there's so many opportunities. I mean, even something as simple as thinking about, are you talking about introducing people in a way that is expansive and allows people to introduce themselves using pronouns in staff meetings? Are you using inclusive language in the workplace? A couple of organizations I know this year gave people a week of rest because they recognized that during the pandemic, it was just affecting everyone's mental, physical, psychic health. And they said, we're going to take a week of radical rest at a couple of philanthropic organizations that I know. And they talked about it, put it in their out of office so that they could also model for others what it meant to say, we're actually taking a week of rest and reflection so that we can come back to the company and do the radical racial justice work we need to be accountable for. But we know we can't actually do it until we each get to take stock of where we are and then come back. So there's many different options. And I just say, try to think about what you feel like you have the most power to move in the next 6 months to a year, and then begin with that.
That's great. And yeah, feel free to get any more questions in before we have to wrap up. I know Jamia's on the East Coast, so I don't want to keep you too long. But you touched a bit about intersectionality earlier, and that brought me to a question that I had. So one of the common criticisms about modern feminism right now is that there isn't enough intersectionality in the public discourse about women's rights. Can you speak a bit more in depth about that, and just maybe about how issues like you said about how the environment, women's rights, racial justice, how all these things are linked? So
what is really important to remember is that all of these things are inextricably connected. The word feminist, and I often, talk about this, a lot of times people say, oh, you call yourself that, but how can you say that when there are people who are practicing a feminism that is not inclusive? And I say they may be doing that, and that might be their approach, but what is feminism is really about the equality and justice of all people, all humans, and that's social equality, economic equality, cultural equality, political equality, and so forth. And in understanding that, and understanding that, yes, we talk about identity in a way that sometimes makes it seem like, oh, it's just about focusing on individuals, when in fact, identity is always connected to systems in a society with the economic structure we have, with the racial histories that we have, with the colonialist histories that we have. And that intersectionality allows us to acknowledge that and to say, we don't just all come in here as a blank tabula rasa. We come here with the experiences of our ancestors and the experiences of our own. And that can be experiences of power and privilege, or a mix of the two, depending on who we are. And so having a knowledge of where you have power and where you have privilege and where you also are marginalized or come from a history or present experience of oppression is a way to be able to understand how to address solutions. And maybe if you're closest to it, you're closest to the answers, or how you can be an ally who is helping those people who are closest to the front lines of the problem by listening, by doing your homework, by deferring to their leadership, to do that work in a righteous way. And I think it's an ongoing process. I think it's important to understand that, we can't just say we want to take all of our toys and go home if somebody says that we didn't necessarily do it right, or that we somehow caused offense. It's time to just say, oh, okay, I've been conditioned in a society that was inherently filled with bias, filled with power imbalances and dynamics that we're trying to heal, that we're trying to transform. And I'm having an awareness of it now. I'm noticing it, I'm observing it, and I'm going to dust off my knee and get better tomorrow, because that is what is deserved. That is the vision, versus, oh, okay, I did this thing. It didn't feel good because someone said that I made a mistake, or that I wasn't mindful enough of the various different issues at play. And I think that's something that I really try to encourage people to do, to say, if something like intersectionality is something that you're trying to understand, but you're still not grasping yet, rather than condemning it or shying away from it, actually lean into it more and listen and seek to understand more than to be understood, and come to that from a place of empathy and compassion, and try to really think about what it might be like to have power look a lot different in your life. And so I love to have those conversations with folks too, because a lot of times I think most people will agree with that. A lot of times what causes the friction is just a fear of feeling like people feel that people want them to be in a place of shame or subjugation just because of who they are, because they have privilege. And my response to that is, no, I want you to use your privilege to make the world better. I want to use your privilege to create a world where your privilege wouldn't be inherent in the first place, and where you wouldn't feel the need to lean on it and protect it. And to ask yourself why you feel the need to protect it. What would it be like if we had a more abundant way of being and doing and experiencing each other and collaborating?
Absolutely. And that actually kind of brings me to an earlier question that I had was that you talked about white privilege, and I feel like a lot of white people in our country now are kind of now only beginning to really fully understand the scope and depth of systemic racism and the privilege that exists in our country. What advice would you give to those people who are just kind of now waking up to the issues and they want to help, but maybe they're a bit fearful to engage in those difficult conversations? Well, what would you say to those people?
I would say that if you focus so much on, I don't want to say the wrong word, I don't want to do the wrong thing, that you're getting in the way of the change that you could make. Speak, do it anyway. What's the worst thing that could happen if someone corrects you? What's the worst thing that could happen if you fall and you skin your knee, but you were trying to make things better and you learn and you do better next time? And I know that can feel really scary to folks, but I often say that when I'll have people say, oh, but I did this and this person on Twitter was mean to me because, you know, I said the wrong thing. And I'll say, okay, you know, that probably didn't feel really good. And I want you to take the moment to do what you need to take care of yourself. But then the issues at hand that we're fighting for, equality, justice, community, partnership, collaboration, communion, all of those things are bigger than our egos.
Yes.
They're bigger than those fears we have of not being liked, or the fears we have of conflict, however we've been conditioned to relate to it. And I have to do that with myself. You know, there's many times where I'm like, you know, this people called me out for this, or I said this ignorant thing. I didn't know that. I didn't understand this kind of power dynamic. And having to come out humbly and saying, okay, I messed up. I'm here to kind of do the work. I'm not going to ask you to do the labor for me. I'm going to read, I'm going to learn. How can I help support you in the work that you're doing? And I'm going to show up next time. I'm going to be accountable and say, I obviously have more to learn. And most people will respond well to that. And so I say, if you find yourself in that place, to really try to embrace the word courage. I know that right now you probably feel like, look, I've had to have enough courage in the time of COVID. And we all have, but we are all being called on to be more brave. We are all being called on to be more courageous. We are all being called on to tell the truth and to stand for truth and to stand to speak our truth and to speak and support others who are truth tellers in this moment. And I think what we're going to have to do is to tell ourselves, yes, maybe standing up righteously may not always feel good, but it's what is necessary. And that in the long view, when I look at this 10 years later, I'm going to know I did the right thing. That is really why we wrote that book. The thing that I really thought, and I don't even have any humans yet, I'm thinking about it, but I have thought, if I have kids and they were to know what happened between the years of 2016 and now, and they asked me when they're learning about it in history class, Mommy, what did you do? I want to be able to be like my mother was when I asked her about segregation and I couldn't believe she had to drink from other water fountains and go to different bathrooms, that I knew that my mom was at the March on Washington. I knew that my mom was doing freedom rides. I knew that my mom was blazing trails for me to have a better life. The life I have right now, some of the many things I take for granted that she didn't have. And so for me, that is the thing that I say to people who are saying, oh, I'm just afraid to say, like, who do you want to be when they are talking about the obituary of your life? That is a question I ask myself a lot. And I know that's really intense. I'm an intense kind of person. But that's what I want. I want, when it's all said and done, for them to say, you know, she had her quirks, but she was true. She tried to stand for what she stood for and to do her very best and to make this world a little bit better while she was here. And that's what we can all do. And I'll give one practical suggestion too, which is to read my friend Layla Saad's book, Me and White Supremacy. Highly recommended. I've seen many of the white people in my life who are really close to me, my husband, some of my family members, and my godson's mother, people I already love and people who already have a sense about racial justice, but, you know, are wanting to do the work. Just seeing them do the work together, I'm just seeing, even though I'm not involved in their process, it's a part of the process that they do it together. I see it show up in my life in really positive ways that make us be able to have better relationship with each other and more understanding. And I would just say that if anyone is looking for something that meaningful they could do between now and the end of the year, that I'm asking all of my white family friends and colleagues who've asked to buy that book and to do the work in it and to buy a copy for a friend.
Yes, absolutely. And that's actually one of the titles that's been, the hold list is out of control at our library. And it's definitely encouraging to see that people are doing the work, and that when you look at the nonfiction bestseller list, you know, many of the titles are anti-racist titles. So it is encouraging. But yes, I agree. I mean, you can't make progress and be comfortable. You have to put yourself in those uncomfortable situations.
Absolutely.
And so I know we're running out of time here, but I know you had an exciting announcement, so I want to make sure that you could talk about that. But I also wanted to ask, do you have any other upcoming books or other projects that you wanted to talk about before we wrap up?
Thank you so much. I have a book called This Book is Feminist coming out in August 2021, and it's going to be for teen and young adult readers, and it's an intersectional primer. So I love that you asked about that. And this book is called, and so the book so I just got a question from Kathy Mack. The book recommended for allies is Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad. And so my book, This Book is Feminist, is also following Tiffany Jewell's book, illustrated by Aurelia Durand, that's called This Book is Anti-Racist. And Aurelia is going to be doing the illustrations for This Book is Feminist as well. So I'm really excited, and a lot of sort of my own personal stories of how intersectionality has been experienced in my life, or what I've observed, along with also statistics and information about feminist theory and intersectionality in an accessible way. So again, although this is for younger readers, I actually think that if I were myself and I was buying the book out, I would be interested in it, because the book's going to break down a lot of concepts, and I talk about just a lot of personal experiences using an intersectional lens to talk about them. So we range everything from disability to power to art to culture to healthcare, to leadership and government and media, et cetera, throughout the book. And I'm really, really excited about it. And I've put a lot of personal heart in it, but also I'm excited to uplift a lot of other voices in it. So in the book, you'll also get to meet a lot of my favorite feminist theorists, known and not so well known, people who have just said things that I think really align with justice and equality. And Aurelia's done a great job doing beautiful visualizations of their words and quotes as well.
That's great. Well, that's exciting. Well, I don't want to keep you, so thank you so much, Jamia. It was a pleasure getting to chat with you. I wish we could go on for another 2 hours, but I know that it's already late on the East Coast. But I'm really appreciative that you could come chat with me and chat to our patrons and our community. And as I said, we're also going to be making this available on our Facebook as well. And thank you to everyone who joined us. I know I can't see you, but I can see that you're here. So thank you for joining us. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Jamia.
Bye. Thank you.